Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 155 and it's titled Ixalan.Dec. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Skyowen over on Discord, and that card is Throne of the Grim Captain. And Throne of the Grim Captain is a super unique artifact that came out of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. It's 2 mana for a legendary artifact, tap, mill 2 cards, and it can craft with a dinosaur, merfolk, pirate, and a vampire for 4. And once we've crafted it, it transforms, and once it's transformed, it becomes the Grim Captain, which is a 7/7 legendary creature, skeleton, spirit, pirate. It's got menace, trample, lifelink, hexproof, and whenever it attacks, each opponent sacrifices a non-land permanent, then you may put an exiled creature card used to craft the Grim Captain onto the battlefield under your control, tapped and attacking. So that is a lot going on just one card, but the most important part of this is that it crafts with a dinosaur, merfolk, pirate, and vampire, which are the 4 main creature types on Ixalan. So we're not 100% an Ixalan deck, but because of the nature of this card, we are playing a bunch of each of those 4 creature types, meaning that there's a lot of Ixalan themes to this deck. With that being said though, we do have a bit of a flavor fail in our commander this week, because we are playing someone who is most definitely not from Ixalan. They are in fact from Dominaria, and that is Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. Sisay is 2 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature human soldier. Sisay, Weatherlight Captain gets +1/+1 for each color among other legendary permanents you control, and you can pay a white, blue, black, red, green, search your library for a legendary permanent card with converted mana cost less than Sisay's power, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So I really struggled to come up with a good commander for this deck because I knew that we wanted to play a bunch of those 4 creature types, and there isn't a ton of overlap in colors, so I kind of assumed we'd have to be 5 color. But it really hit me with Sisay when I realized that the Throne of the Grim Captain is legendary. Being able to search it out with Sisay is incredibly perfect because what better way to build around a card than to make sure we always have access to it? Now, we can't get it right away. It is 2 mana, which means we need to have at least 1 other legendary permanent in play, but that shouldn't be too difficult. And being able to have access to all of our colors and to tutor in the command zone means that we can effectively build a pretty janky style deck around an odd card, as long as we can tutor it up. So with that being said, let's take a look at some of the themes for this deck and look at how we actually put this together. The first thing to mention is, of course, we're playing our relevant creature types. We're playing dinosaurs, vampires, merfolk, and pirates. And I would put all 4 of them right here, but there isn't a creature that is all 4, which is probably for the best. I feel like that would be a very odd-looking creature. But we do have one that's at least 2 of them with Galta and Mavrin, which is 3 green, white for a 12/12 legendary creature dinosaur vampire. It is not, in fact, a vampire that is also a dinosaur. It is both a dinosaur and a vampire mushed together on one card, which is a tragedy. But it has trample. Whenever you attack, choose 1. Create a tapped and attacking XX green dinosaur creature token with trample, where X is the greatest power among other attacking creatures, or create X 1/1 white vampire creature tokens with lifelink, where X is the number of other attacking creatures. So Galta and Mavrin doesn't play particularly well with everything that we're doing. It really focuses a lot on either going wide or going tall, and we're not particularly great at either. We typically want to have a handful of strong creatures, not one big one or a ton of little ones, so it can kind of be hit or miss depending on what we can get with it. But it's still a 12/12 for only 7 mana, which isn't too terrible, and we are in green, we're 5 colors, so we do have ways to ramp into it, but it is a little bit tricky. The nice thing about it is that it does count as both a dinosaur and a vampire, so if we do need to craft it with the Throne of the Grim Captain, we can do that. Now, with all of that being said, let's move on to our next theme, and you may have noticed we've talked a lot about legendary spells, and our commander can tutor up legendary spells. So our next theme is legendaries. Being able to cast as many legendaries as possible, I leaned pretty hard into the theme of only playing dinosaurs, vampires, merfolk, and pirates that are legendary. So there's a ton of other great creatures that fit those types, but because they're not legendary, you're not going to find them in this deck. However, we did make some exceptions for legends that are not our relevant creature types because they play so well with other legendary creatures. And a great example of that is Shanid Sleeper's Scourge, which is 1 red, white, black for a 2/4 legendary creature human knight. She has Menace. Whenever another legendary creature or legendary land is cast or put into play, we draw a card and lose a life, and other legendary creatures we control have Menace. Being able to turn every single one of our legendary spells into card draw is incredibly important. Now, we don't really have legendary lands to take advantage of this, but we don't necessarily need it. Being able to draw cards just off of playing our spells is pretty good as it is, and giving things Menace is also pretty effective at making sure we can get through our attacks, because we don't really have another way to win the game. Our main goal of winning is through combat. So that is theme number 2. And theme number 3 plays nicely with both of them because, again, we've talked about how expensive some of our legendary cards are, and that is ramp. We need to make sure that we can cast all of our spells, which is a little bit tricky for a couple of different reasons. Number 1, this is a 5-color deck, and typically when I build a 5-color budget deck, I tend to put gates in the mana base. I did not do that this time because I wanted to spend more of our budget on the actual creatures themselves, which pushed us too close to the budget limit, and I couldn't squeeze enough gates in for me to want to build that mana base. So instead, we leaned more into cards that can mana fix, like Relic of Legends, and some ramp spells that can get basic lands, and we're playing more basics. So Relic of Legends is 3 mana for an artifact, tap, add 1 mana of any color, and tap an untapped legendary creature you control, add 1 mana of any color. This now turns all of our creatures into essentially Birds of Paradise, being able to tap for a mana of any color, but it also means that because the ability is coming from the Relic of Legends itself, those creatures don't need to be having haste, they don't need to not have summoning sickness. We can cast a creature and immediately tap it for mana to cast more creatures. Being able to flood the board with giant creatures like Galta and Mavrin or Shanid means that we can slowly outvalue our opponents and get to the point where there's not much they can do to deal with the permanents we have in play. And worst case scenario, we flood the board with a ton of permanents and then they get board wiped away. Throne of the Grim Captain can still craft with cards in the graveyard, so it's not that big of a deal. But those are all of our themes for this week, and the next thing we got to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that synergize really well with what we're trying to do, and in some cases might be win conditions, or at least value pieces that push us toward a win. So the first of our key cards is Bard Class. And Bard Class is a pretty essential card for any legendary deck that includes green and red, but essentially it is a class, it's an enchantment, comes in at level 1 and immediately says legendary creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them. You can level it up to level 2 for a green and a red. Legendary spells you cast cost a red and a green less to cast. This effect reduces only the amount of colored mana you play. And for 3 red and a green, you can level it up to level 3. Whenever you cast a legendary spell, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. So every single step of Bard Class does exactly what we want it to be doing. Number 1, it's making our creatures bigger. Level 2, it's making our creatures cost less. And level 3, it's letting our creatures draw us cards. If we're not benefiting from card draw, ramp, and +1/+1 counters, then we're probably not doing much at the table. So Bard Class really ticks all the boxes and does everything we want it to be doing. This is by far one of the most important cards in the entire deck. However, it's not the only important card. We do have some others as well. So our next key card is going to be Cadric Soul Kindler. Again, one of the few creatures that doesn't fit any of our 4 major creature types, but definitely earns a spot nonetheless, because Cadric is 2 red, white for a 4/3 dwarf wizard. The legend rule doesn't apply to tokens you control. Whenever another non-token legendary permanent enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1. If you do, create a token that's a copy of it, that token gains haste, and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This is a great way to double up on our legendary creatures, and more specifically, we want to double up on the creatures that either have entered the battlefield effects, maybe have some sort of relevant attack trigger, or we get some kind of value from them being in play because we're all of a sudden going to have 2 of them. And yes, it does go away at the end of turn, but that's not the worst thing that can have happen to us because we still get any effects from entering, attacking, or just being in play for the turn. So Cadric, while not a merfolk, pirate, vampire, or dinosaur, definitely earns a spot in here. This dwarf wizard deserves to be among some of the best of those creature types. And then finally, we get to our last key card. And again, leaning into the legendary subtheme, we have the Flowering of the White Tree. This is a white for a legendary enchantment. Legendary creatures you control get +2/+1 and have ward 1, and non-legendary creatures you control get +1/+1. So we're obviously not going to be making use of the non-legendary creatures aspect quite as much, but being able to give all of our legendary creatures +2/+1 is a huge boost to their power. And ward 1, while not necessarily the best form of ward, is still enough to make our opponents double, kind of triple even sometimes, check to see if they really want to kill our creatures. Because turning a Swords to Plowshares from a 1-mana removal spell into a 2-mana removal spell means that our opponents might have tapped a little too much mana, they might not want to spend more to kill our things, and it's a great way to push them to look at our opponent's stuff instead. Now, again, that's not to say that this is an impossible casting cost. People can easily pay an extra 1, but sometimes it's a little bit too much of a pain in the butt for our opponents to have to deal with. Now, that is all of our key cards, so the next piece of our deck tech is to take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize very well together and work in unique ways, or sometimes are just fun cards that I like to highlight. So our first cool interaction is going to be between Anhelo the Painter and Rada-Drabic of Urborg. So Anhelo is blue, black, red for a 1/3 legendary creature vampire assassin, so one of our 4 creature types. Death Touch, and the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn has Casualty 2. And what that means is we can sacrifice a creature with power 2 or greater to copy the spell that we cast. That becomes relevant when Rada-Drabic of Urborg is also in play, because Rada-Drabic is 2 white-black for a 3/3 legendary creature zombie wizard. Yes, not one of the 4 creature types once again. I know I'm highlighting a lot of them, but it's worth it, trust me. He has Vigilance, Ward 2, other zombies you control have Vigilance, and whenever another legendary creature you control dies, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary, and is a 2/2 black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. So essentially, what we can do here is with Anhelo and Rada-Drabic in play, we can cast any instant or sorcery spell. It's got Casualty 2. We can sacrifice any of our legendary creatures. That triggers Rada-Drabic, meaning we make a non-legendary token copy of it, which is a 2/2 black zombie, so we still get to keep the creature while sacrificing something, putting the actual creature card in the graveyard, which can then be crafted with Throne of the Grim Captain, and we get to copy the spell that we cast. All of that happens for just casting a single spell. Well, obviously casting a single spell after also casting Anhelo and Rada-Drabic, but my point being that is a lot of value for not a lot of setup. And the even more important thing is that the zombies that Rada-Drabic creates have power too, so if we desperately need to copy another instant or sorcery spell, we still have a creature that we can casualty for 2. Yes, we have to wait at least a turn because we could only do it for the first spell we cast each turn, but it still gives us 2 chances for Casualty 2 in a moment when we might only have 3 creatures in play. And we still get to wind up keeping 2 of them, so I would call that a win in my books. But that is only cool interaction number 1. Cool interaction number 2, going to look a little bit different, but still focus on value. This is going to be between Anji Falconwrath and Olivia Crimson Bride. And I know these are both actually from Innistrad. They have a lot of synergies because that's just what the Rakdos vampires do on Innistrad. But I wanted to highlight these because I do think they're pretty important to what the deck is trying to do. First up, Anji is 1, a black, and a red for a 1/3 legendary creature vampire. She's got haste, tap, discard a card, draw a card. Whenever you discard a card, if it has madness, untap Anji Falconwrath. We don't really have madness in the deck, that's not going to be relevant, but she's a great way to fill up the graveyard for Olivia Crimson Bride, which is 4 black and a red for a 3/4 legendary creature vampire noble. She has flying and haste, and whenever Olivia attacks, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains, when you don't control a legendary vampire, exile this creature. Obviously, you can kind of see what we're trying to do here. Anji could put a huge creature into the graveyard. Olivia can then come down and attack, reanimate that creature, and obviously we would have to exile it if we don't control a legendary vampire, but we've got Anji, we've got Olivia, we have a ton of legendary vampires in the deck, so hopefully we'll be good to go, and it even works out if we're able to reanimate a legendary vampire, then we don't even need to keep Anji and Olivia around, it can keep itself around. So a great way to get back some of the more expensive cards in the deck, because Dinosaurs can be pretty expensive, there's vampires that can be pretty expensive, less so on the Merfolk and the Pirates, but there are some that are a little bit up there in mana cost. So Olivia's a great way to get them back, and Anji's a great way to make sure that we can pick and choose what we're getting, and even kind of sneak attack it into play from our opponent's perspective, because we can activate Anji right before we attack with Olivia, so we can get something that they might not even be expecting. So those are all of our cool interactions for this week. The next thing we got to do for this deck is, of course, take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, our price came in at $87.16, with a huge portion of that actually coming in from one card, which is Etali Primal Conqueror at a massive $14.59. So obviously, Etali is a phenomenal card. It is 5 red for a legendary creature Elder Dinosaur. It's a 7/7, it's got trample. When Etali enters the battlefield, each player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. You may cast any number of spells from among the non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. Then you can pay 9 and a Phyrexian green to transform Etali, only as a sorcery of course, into Etali Primal Sickness, which is an 11/11 Phyrexian Elder Dinosaur, trample, indestructible, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get that many poison counters. So, a couple of key things about this one. One, because this is the most expensive card in the deck, if you did want to cut it out, that would trim the price down to about $73, which is a lot more manageable than $87. However, if you are able to keep it in, Etali is a great card to have for crafting to Throne of the Grim Captain. It's a great card to have for reanimating with Olivia. It is a card that really benefits from Kadric's ability to make a token. Anything that gives us multiple enter the battlefield triggers is phenomenal with Etali. So if you can keep it in, I do think it's one of the strongest cards in the entire deck, hence the price. But obviously, if you do need to cut it, there are plenty of legendary Merfolk, Pirate, Dinosaurs, and Vampires that we were not able to include, so you can definitely find a cheaper one to replace it with. On the other hand, if you're looking for a more expensive card to put into the deck that's going to be a little bit out of budget and also be somewhat of a quality of life upgrade, I do have a suggestion there for you as well. Now, this might be a bit of an obvious include, but we don't have a ton of pirates, so it does make sense to include Ragavan Nimble Pilferer if you're looking to upgrade the deck. However, Ragavan is a massive $41.81, so it certainly does not fit into our budget. It is, however, one of the best pirates that's ever been printed, And we do struggle a lot with our cheap creatures. There's not a ton of legendary creatures that fit our creature types that are very cheap. We tend to have stuff to do starting at 2 mana, but we don't really have anything at 1. And so Ragavan is a great fit for our 1 mana slot because it is a single red for a 2/1 Monkey Pirate. Whenever Ragavan deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token and exile the top card of that player's library. Until the end of turn, you may cast that card. Then it also has dash for 1 and a red. Now, Ragavan does quickly get outclassed in a game, but being able to just kind of sneak it in with its dash ability or have it in play as a blocker even is a great way to use it in a 4-player game. Plus, there's always a chance that one player just doesn't have blockers and we can kind of get in with it when we need to. However, if you are including a new card to the deck, you obviously would have to take a card out. And the card that I would recommend taking out is Illuna, Apex of Wishes. And this might look like a weird card to suggest taking out because it is a very powerful card. It's 2 green, blue, red for a 6/6 beast elemental dinosaur. It has mutate for 3 and a hybrid green, red, blue, blue. Flying Trample. Whenever this creature mutates, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land permanent card. Put that card onto the battlefield or into your hand. Now, like I said, this is not a bad card, so it does look weird that I would suggest taking it out, but there's a couple of reasons that I would suggest this. The first is that it doesn't give us a ton of value beyond the 6 mana mutate cost, which, while good, is still a bit of a struggle. 6 mana is not the cheapest thing in the world, and being able to exile cards until we hit a non-land permanent is good, but because we could hit anything and then it goes into our hand, this risks us exiling things that we could possibly want, like Throne of the Grim Captain, for example, and if we exile things, we have no way to get them back. So I do think Illuna is better suited for a combo strategy or a card that really has a way to get stuff back, maybe something like Pull from Eternity, something that can remove things from exile. I don't think this is the deck for Illuna. She's really only in here because she's a dinosaur, which, again, very good. Having on-brand creature types is good. But in this case, I think Ragavan would just be better. Anyway, though, with all of that being said, the next thing we gotta do is check out how this deck performs in a game. Before we get to that, we're going to take a quick second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So, obviously, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That is amazing. You can always do that. But if you're looking to find us in other places, you can find us on Twitter, Reddit, send us an email. You can also support us a little bit more directly over on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you'll get amazing content such as the deck lists a week early, which always comes in handy. I've had my patrons catch a lot of mistakes that I've made in my deck lists. Being able to join a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games. So if you've ever wanted to be a part of the games on this channel, that is the place to go. You also get the unedited gameplay videos. You get a card sent to you every month that is one of the cards that we've built around. And you get the guarantee from me that any suggestions you make will be turned into videos for the channel eventually. I will obviously do my best to get to everyone's suggestions, so if you have them, please do put them in the comments or send them to me on Twitter, Reddit, or by email. But I can't promise to get to them in the same way that I can for our patrons and our channel members. So if that's something you're interested in, and you would like to join the amazing people listed below, who of course deserve a shout out. So let's give a shout out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And if you'd like to join them, do check us out on Patreon or right here in the description of the video as a channel member. With all of that being said, now let's actually get into our game. So this week, we are playing against 3 separate opponents, bringing 3 brand new decks to the table. Well, I say brand new. One of them is an older deck that's just been tweaked a little bit, but it's got some nice upgrades. So this week, we are playing against Bilal, playing Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, which we just spoke about. We have Jason playing Davros Dalek Creator, and we have Doodle playing Dong Zhao the Tyrant. So Bilal's Ragavan.Dec is a bit of a new one. I don't believe I've played against it before. I know he's had it for a little while, but it is kind of what it looks like. It's a mono red style deck. He wants to be very aggressive. He wants to make treasures. He wants to steal his opponent's things, and he just wants to be able to get Ragavan in attacking as early as possible and just accrue value throughout the course of the game. So I know that Ragavan can be a bit of a menace in other formats, Modern in particular, so I'm interested to see how it functions in Commander. I know that I suggested putting it in earlier, but I haven't actually seen it as a commander for a deck before, so I'm interested to see how a guaranteed Ragavan on turn 1 can really shake things up. Next up, we have Jason and his Davros deck. This is 100% the pre-con Doctor Who deck, so he is playing Davros, and all of the cards that came in the pre-constructed deck, he made no changes. I don't know if he plans to make changes in the future, but I do know Jason has a pretty good track record with precons. He tends to be a pretty good pilot of decks, all things considered. So I do imagine that over the course of the game, there's going to be a lot of Daleks that are made, there's going to be a lot of villainous choices, and since it's in Grixis colors, Jason is very much playing the colors that he feels pretty good with. So I am a little concerned about this, but I don't want to say it's our biggest threat at the table simply because of the precon level. However, I will say the biggest threat at the table is probably Dong Zhao the Tyrant. Coming from Doodle, this is a monster of a deck. He's played it a couple of times, even though I know right now it's been upgraded quite a bit. So the main goal of the Dong Zhao deck is to make as many copies of Dong Zhao as possible, so he banks on his opponents having big creatures, or gives them big creatures, so that way he can cast his commander, make a creature do damage equal to its power to its controller, and just kind of burn out the table by copying his commander as many times as possible. So I've definitely lost to this deck before. I know that it is an immense powerhouse, even though it doesn't look like it on the surface. So very cool deck. I'm excited to see what it can do, but I am very worried about it. So with all of that being said, let me know down in the comments who you think might win this game. Get your predictions in. Hopefully you all enjoy it. I'm sure I certainly will, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by myself, Jason, and then Doodle. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a mountain and casts his commander Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, letting him make a treasure and exile the top card of an opponent's library when it deals combat damage to them, letting Bilal cast the exiled spell until the end of turn. I play a Frontier Bivouac. Jason plays a Thriving Moor, naming blue so it taps for blue or black. Doodle plays a Desert of the Fervent. Bilal plays a mountain and attacks me for 2 with Ragavan, making a treasure and exiling Command Tower from the top of my library. In his second main phase, he casts Thopter Engineer, making a 1/1 Thopter token and giving all his artifact creatures haste. I play a Jungle Shrine. Jason plays a Creeping Tar Pit. Doodle plays a Smoldering Crater and exiles Heat Shimmer from his hand to evoke a Fury, doing 1 damage to Ragavan and 3 to the Thopter Engineer when it enters, killing them both, and then the Fury sacrifices itself. Bilal plays a mountain and recasts his commander, Ragavan. I play a Nomad Outpost and cast Bard class, letting my legendary creatures enter with an additional +1/+1 counter. Jason plays a mountain and casts Vashta Narada, which has Shadow, Indestructible, and gets a +1/+1 counter in each end step if a creature died that turn. Doodle plays an Arcane Lighthouse and casts Shiny Impetus, enchanting Vashta Narada so that it's goaded, gets +2/+2, and makes Doodle a treasure token when it attacks. Bilal plays a mountain and attacks me with Ragavan for 2, making a treasure and exiling a Tali Primal Conqueror from the top of my library. In his second main phase, he casts a Vengeful Ancestor, goading a creature when it enters or attacks, and also doing 1 damage to an opponent whenever a goaded creature they control attacks. With this trigger, Bilal goads the Vashta Narada, meaning it's forced to attack me on Jason's next turn. I play an island and level up Bard class, making my legendary creatures cost a red and a green less to cast. This lets me cast Calamax the Stormsire, entering with a +1/+1 counter, letting me copy the first instant I cast each turn as long as it's tapped, and also putting a +1/+1 counter on it whenever I copy an instant spell. Jason plays a Darkwater Catacomb and casts his commander, Davros-Dalek Creator. He attacks me for 3 with Vashta Nerada, losing a life and letting Doodle make a treasure. Then, in his end step, Davros triggers, letting Jason make a 3/3 Dalek since an opponent lost 3 or more life this turn, and then since I lost 3 or more life, I face a villainous choice, choosing to either discard a card or let Jason draw a card. This time I choose to let Jason draw a card. Doodle plays a Spine Rock Gnoll, hiding away a card, then cast Humble Defector, which can tap to let Doodle draw 2 cards, then an opponent has to be given control of it. Bilal attacks Doodle for 3 with Vengeful Ancestor, goading Calamax on attacks. Second main phase, he casts Pia and Kiran Nalaar, making 2 Thopter tokens when they enter, letting him pay 3 mana to sacrifice an artifact to do 2 damage to any target. Then he cast Mox Opal. On my turn, I attack Jason for 5 with Calamax, losing a life, and in my second main phase, I cast Harrow, copying it thanks to Calamax, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, then sacrificing a land and searching my library for a total of 4 basic lands, putting them all into play. After that's resolved, I cast Kadric Soul Kindler, entering with a +1/+1 counter, letting me pay 1 when a non-token legendary permanent enters under my control to make a token copy of it with haste that is sacrificed at the beginning of my next end step, and also prevents the legend rule from applying to my tokens. Jason attacks Doodle for 3 with Davros, me for 3 with Dalek, and Bilal for 3 with Vashta Nerada, losing a life, letting Doodle make a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts a Valyard, making his opponents face any villainous choices twice, and letting Jason vote an additional time for any voting that happens. He then plays a Temple of Malice, scrying 1, and when he moves to his end step, Davros triggers, making him another Dalek token since an opponent lost 3 life this turn, and each opponent faces the same villainous choice twice, either discarding a card or letting Jason draw a card. This ends with Doodle and Bilal both discarding 2, while I discard 1 and Jason draws a card. On Doodle's turn, he activates the Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and giving control of it to Bilal. He then casts the One Ring, gaining protection from everything until his next turn, and also being able to tap it, put a burden counter on it, and draw cards equal to the number of burden counters on it, while also losing life equal to the burden counters in his upkeep. Once it resolves, Doodle immediately taps it, putting a burden counter on it, and drawing a card. On Bilal's turn, he activates the Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and returning control of it to Doodle. He then attacks Jason for 5 with all of his flyers, goading Davros. In his second main phase, Bilal casts Rekindling Phoenix. On my turn, I cast Jeru and Hazoret, getting a +1/+1 counter, paying 1 to make a copy of it when it enters, and looking at the top 6 cards of my library when it attacks, exiling a legendary creature from among them, being able to cast the exiled card for free until the end of my turn. I attack Jason for 6 with Calamax, and attack Bilal for 6 with the copy of Jeru and Hazoret. Unfortunately, with the attack trigger though, I don't find a legendary creature in the top 6 cards of my library. Bilal blocks with Pia and Kiran, killing them while Jason takes 6. Then at the end of turn, I sacrifice the copy of Jeru and Hazoret. Jason moves straight to combat, attacking Doodle for 3 with Davros, and Bilal for 3 with Vashta Nerada, losing 2 life and making Doodle a treasure. Bilal takes the damage, while the damage going at Doodle is prevented thanks to the One Ring. In his second main phase, Jason casts Ensnared by the Mara, making each opponent face a villainous choice to either exile cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card, letting Jason cast it without paying its mana cost, or they have to exile the top 4 cards of their library and take damage equal to the total mana value of cards exiled. Then, thanks to the Valyard, that choice happens again. Doodle chooses to exile until he hits 2 non-lands, giving Jason Neheb the Eternal and Dualcaster Mage. Bilal chooses to exile the top 8 cards of his library, taking 24 damage, and I choose to exile the top 8 cards of my library, taking 8. It's also worth noting that when I exile my top 8, I hit the card of the week, Throne of the Grim Captain. Once that's resolved, Jason plays a Choked Estuary, and at the end of turn, since an opponent lost 7 or more life this turn, Doodle can activate Spine Rock Gnoll, casting Crawl Space for free, preventing more than 2 creatures from attacking him. Still at the end of turn, since Bilal and I lost more than 3 life, we both face a villainous choice, letting Jason draw 4 cards, and he makes another Dalek. In Doodle's upkeep, he loses a life to the One Ring, plays Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, and activates Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and passing control of it to Bilal. He then casts Chain Reaction, doing 17 damage to each creature since there are 17 creatures in play, killing everything except Vashta Narada, and also making Bilal a 0/1 elemental token when Rekindling Phoenix dies. Once that's resolved, Doodle activates the One Ring, putting a burden counter on it and drawing 2 cards. Then at the end of turn, Jason puts a +1/+1 counter on Vashta Narada. In Bilal's upkeep, he sacrifices his elemental token to return Rekindling Phoenix from his graveyard to the battlefield with haste, then plays a mountain and casts his commander Ragavan for his dash cost, letting it enter with haste but returning to his hand in the next end step. This lets him attack Doodle for 2 with Ragavan, making a treasure, and exiling Sanctum of Eternity from the top of Doodle's library. Then in the end step, Ragavan returns to Bilal's hand. On my turn, I play a Path of Ancestry and cast Shanid Sleeper's Scourge, entering with a counter, giving all my legendary creatures menace and letting me draw a card and lose a life whenever I cast a legendary spell or play a legendary land. I also cast Parness the Subtle Brush, entering with a counter, drawing a card, losing a life, countering any spell that targets me or my permanents unless the opponent targeting it pays 4 life, and also, whenever I copy a spell, I can let target opponent copy it as well. Jason plays a Temple of the False God and attacks me for 4 with Vashta Narada, making Doodle a treasure token. In his second main phase, he casts Renegade Silent, goading a creature in his end step, putting a +1/+1 counter on the Silent and phasing it out. This turn he goads the Rekindling Phoenix, puts a counter on the Silent, and phases it out. In Doodle's upkeep, he loses 2 life to the One Ring, plays a mountain, and casts Rionia Fire Dancer, so at the beginning of combat on his turn, he creates X tokens that are copies of another target creature he controls, where X is 1, plus the number of instants and sorceries he's cast this turn. Then the tokens are exiled at the beginning of the next end step. He also activates the One Ring, putting a burden counter on it and drawing 3 cards. Finally, he cast a Ruby Medallion, making all his red spells cost 1 less to cast. Bilal casts Koth Fire of Resistance, activating his +1 ability to search his library for a mountain, putting it into his hand, and then playing it for the turn. He then dashes in his commander Ragavan, attacking Jason for 2 with the monkey, and Doodle for 4 with Rekindling Phoenix. Before blocks, Jason flashes in Weeping Angel, using it to block Ragavan, and when it does damage, it's prevented, and Ragavan gets shuffled into Bilal's library, but he instead chooses to put it into the command zone. Then Jason takes no damage, while Doodle takes 4. On my turn, I cast Arvad the Cursed, giving all my other legendary creatures +2/+2, drawing a card, losing a life, then he enters with a +1/+1 counter. A creature entering also triggers Weeping Angel, meaning it's no longer a creature until the end of turn. I also cast Rising of the Day, giving all my creatures haste and legendary creatures +1/+0. I attack Bilal for 5, Doodle for 4, and Jason for 7, gaining 4 life thanks to Arvad's lifelink. On Jason's turn, he plays a Sunken Hollow tapped and recasts his commander Davros, then attacks Doodle for 2 with Weeping Angel and me for 4 with Vashta Narada, making Doodle a treasure token. At the end of turn, Jason goads Rionia, puts a +1/+1 counter on the Silence, phases it out, makes a Dalek, and makes me face a villainous choice, which I choose to let Jason draw a card. In Doodle's upkeep, he loses 3 life to the One Ring, then plays a War Room and casts his commander Dong Zhao the Tyrant, making target creature do damage equal to its power to its controller when it enters the battlefield. With this trigger, he has Shanid do 7 damage to me and loses 4 life to do so. Once that's resolved, Doodle casts Jeska's Will, choosing both modes since his commander is in play, making 6 red mana since Jason has 6 cards in hand, and exiling the top 3 cards of his library, being able to cast them this turn. This has him exiling a Mountain, Flame Rush Rider, and Slicer Hired Muscle. After that, he blitzes in Jaxis the Troublemaker so that she has haste, must be sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step, and draws a card when she dies. He then activates Jaxus, discarding a Strionic Resonator to make a token copy of Dong Zhao, which enters and has Vashta Narada do 4 damage to Jason before sacrificing the copy and drawing a card. After that's resolved, Doodle casts Reckless Handling, searching his library for an artifact, putting it into his hand, then discarding a card at random. This has him putting Cursed Mirror into his hand and discarding Command Beacon. He then casts Sulfuric Vortex, preventing players from gaining life and doing 2 damage to a player in their upkeep. He also casts Cursed Mirror, entering as a copy of Dong Zhao, making Rekindling Phoenix do 4 damage to Bilal, then Doodle sacrifices the mirror to the Legend Rule. When Doodle moves to combat, Rionya triggers, making 3 copies of Dong Zhao, all of which get sacrificed to the Legend Rule, but this has me taking another 7 damage from Shanid while Doodle pays 4 life, and Jason taking 4 from Davros twice. Finally, Doodle attacks me for 3 with Rionya, knocking me out of the game. In his second main phase, Doodle activates the One Ring, putting a burden counter on it and drawing 4 cards. This means that Jason only has to attack Doodle with his Vashta Narada and Davros for 9 on his turn, since Doodle can't block either of them, and Bilal dies to the Sulfuric Vortex, winning Jason the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. We definitely didn't quite get off the ground with everything we were trying to do. We put up a pretty impressive board state pretty quickly, but we didn't exactly get to the point we needed to get to, especially because we did exile Throne of the Grim Captain permanently, which was a huge blow to the deck. Little unfortunate, but I do think you still saw some of the power of our deck. We definitely ramped quite a bit. We got a lot of big creatures into play. We got some card draw going. It was a very synergistic deck, and it felt good to play. Despite the fact that we had so many basics, we never really struggled for mana. So I think that was a good mark in favor of the deck. I do think that we probably should have tried to get Throne of the Grim Captain in play earlier. I had a lot of chances to get Sisay into play and then could have tutored up the throne, but I chose not to in favor of playing some of the other cards in our hand, so maybe a bit of a mistake on my part. Let me know what you think in the comments. And then going around the table, we'll go counterclockwise around. We'll talk about Bilal's Ragavan deck. I was very impressed by Ragavan hitting the board early. Definitely felt like there was always a target. There were a couple of turns where he couldn't swing with his commander, but almost always he was able to get in with someone, which meant that he was always making treasures. He was always getting options because it was like drawing a card from an opponent's library, which was super cool. And he showed some of the goad synergies that came from mono red as well. There was actually quite a bit of goad at the table this week, which hindered us a little bit, but overall very cool showing from Bilal's Ragavan deck. Next up, Doodle and his Dong Zhao deck came incredibly close to winning the game. I know that at the end when he copied Dong Zhao, I think it was 4 or 5 total times on his turn, he was able to get very, very close to winning. And I think that he tried to survive with the crawl space, forgetting that the Vashta Narada could attack him and in fact had to attack him given the goad that was on it. I think that if he'd found a way to either get rid of that or prevent the Vashta Narada from attacking at all, I think he could have survived the turn. And obviously if he had survived, he'd had enough ways to copy Dong Zhao that he would have taken down the game. So once again, we do get to see Jason pulling out a victory with a pre-constructed deck, which is, I don't want to say an uncommon thing. This is something that Jason tends to be pretty good at. I've lost to Jason playing precons quite a bit in the past, so I'm not exactly surprised by it, but what I was surprised by was the power coming from the Davros deck. I didn't expect the villainous choices to make that much of a difference in the long run, but just letting Jason draw 1, maybe even up to 3 cards every single turn was very, very impressive, and I'm very impressed by Davros as a commander. I didn't think too much of it when Jason sat down to play it, but now having seen it in action, I am very impressed. So, a very good showing by everybody all around. Hopefully you all enjoyed the game. I know I certainly did. Hopefully you all enjoyed the deck tech. I think this deck was a ton of fun to put together and a super unique build. Definitely very flavorful for Ixalan, even though we don't have an Ixalan commander. But let me know down in the comments what you think. Please do like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.